Mutual Broadcasting System presents STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. With today's briefing, here is retired Marine Intelligence Officer Lieutenant Colonel Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk, and today I'm going to talk about what's happening in the wake of these devastating earthquakes that have occurred in Venezuela, and I'm going to talk about what this means to the United States, what it means to other countries in Western Hemisphere, what it means to other countries around the world, but I'm really going to get into, I'm not going to take away from what's happened, but I am going to talk about kind of the nature of how this thing works. So let me just say something right up front and be very clear about this. This is a horrible disaster. All right. It's incurred massive destruction, death, suffering. There's at least 50,000 people unaccounted for. They're missing. As of this recording, we're talking close to 1,000 people confirmed dead. There's thousands more that have been seriously injured. And when you have 50,000 missing, that doesn't mean they're all buried, under the rubble. But it does mean that you probably a certain percentage of that is going to end up, they're not accounted for because, well, frankly, they're either trapped or they may be deceased. And so we're going to find out about that. I think it was the U.S. Geological Survey put out an estimate early on that they said there's a 42% chance that the deaths from this thing could be 10,000 to 100,000. That is really significant. But I do think that we have a situation where there's a lot of damage, a lot of destruction. The communications, our lines of communication are down all over the place. So we're just not getting word. So we're not getting a really clear idea of how many people have been hurt, let alone how many people have been killed. And it's going to take a while for that to catch up. And it's going to get worse. The numbers are going to go one direction and it's not down. So that's coming. The government of Venezuela is not only unable to provide the assistance support necessary to meet the needs of rescuing those trapped and helping all of the others that need help, but the perception, at least from what I can tell on the streets in Venezuela, is that the government just is simply unable to do this most critical thing that government's supposed to do. In times of crisis, the government's supposed to be able to help, provide assistance, provide a certain degree of safety or security or whatever. They simply cannot do it. They're unable to do this. The sort of community level emergency response teams or, teams that could go in and help them just simply are not there. And people are having to dig out their neighbors, their friends, their loved ones out of the rubble on their own, putting their own lives in peril in doing that. And so that's why international assistance has become so important. That's why assistance from the United States has become so important. Also, this is a systemic issue within Venezuela. Maduro pushed back against the West. It wasn't just the oil infrastructure that started breaking down, became dilapidated and largely dysfunctional under his rule. Everything became dilapidated under his rule, to include heavy equipment, the sort of heavy equipment you need to lift fallen walls of brick and cement, and to dig people out of fallen structures and collapsed buildings. A lot of that heavy equipment just is not functioning due to lack of spare parts, lack of maintenance, which are kind of endemic to what that regime was about. So that's another thing that is really hanging over the heads of the regime, the current regime, even with allowing U.S. assistance and other foreign assistance come in. They're looking at the fact that this government has just failed, and that's going to have a certain political dynamic. A lot of that going to the intransigence that was under Maduro and Chavez, his predecessor. So everybody's helping each other out. They're trying to do this stuff, but I will say this, that in those situations, and anybody who's worked urban search and rescue, certainly on the public safety side, will tell you that when you have people earnest, well-meaning, going in there to do this without proper training, without proper equipment, without helmets and things like that, they can often go in there and they will, they're digging people out. People are trapped between spaces and they're digging people out, but they're not thinking of shoring up that heavy weight in such a way that it won't collapse once they dig them out. In many cases, they create problems. In fact, in many cases, the USAR urban search and rescue forces are going in to rescue the rescuers who actually became victims in the process of helping others. So that's something we're going to have to look at. Now, we're looking at what's going on here. I should mention this was caused by two very powerful earthquakes. The first one was a 7.2 magnitude earthquake, which was literally followed, I think, 40 seconds later by a 7.5 magnitude earthquake. Both of them very close. They struck near the coast of Venezuela, and it's knocked down buildings in Caracas, the capital, and certainly knocked down a lot of buildings, caused tremendous devastation closer to the epicenter, and it's causing all sorts of problems with communications, obviously roads. You've got debris in the roads. You got roads that have been damaged by the seismic forces themselves. I'm sure a lot of the bridges are certainly, if they haven't collapsed, are very unstable, and there's a lot of concern about that. Now, responders were undertaking what have been called intensive rescue efforts, but again, you just don't have the public safety apparatus in Venezuela to really do a lot. Now, the U.S. stepped in immediately. We launched two what are called USAR teams. These are top-tier FEMA-supported, Department of Homeland Security-supported teams. One of them is in Los Angeles County, led by the fire department there. The other one's in Fairfax County. Now, they're a multidisciplinary interagency effort. They come in with a lot of different capabilities, but they're about 80 members each. They've deployed. They use normally military aircraft, and I understand they're doing that this time to deploy. And they've been around for a long time. I've had the pleasure of interfacing with them, training them in things like counterterrorism over the many years, and just absolutely top notch in every sense of that. So they're going down there. They bring a lot of capabilities. They don't bring normally heavy equipment, though, and that's one of the things that's really needed, and it's needed fast. There is that, not so much a golden hour, but there is a golden period where people are trapped under the rubble that they can get in there and rescue them and save them. But every hour that goes by, certainly every day that goes by, it becomes less of a rescue effort, more of a recovery effort. And so getting down there and doing things quickly is absolutely critical. Now, military assets have been tasked to go down. There's been ships tasked. One of them is a kind of a heavier lift ship, which will be able to bring in a lot of things like heavy equipment, along with a lot of other needed things. And then you have aircraft. C-17s, for example, have been dispatched. I think we have probably some C-130s. Those are very useful because they can get in and out of the smaller airfields. One of the big issues, one of the big tasks right up front is to get these airfields back in full operations. And many times you will find that airports with long runways, because of the seismic action, will have problems with those long runways. So they may not be able to use the whole thing right afterwards. So there may be aircraft with shorter takeoff and landing capabilities like the C-130 would be very useful. And then as they open up more, or basically either verify, validate, or fix these airports, they'll get in larger aircraft like the C-17. So that'll come over time, that heavy lift stuff. A Marine Corps two-star general, Kevin Jarrett, he's from Marine Forces South, or MARFOR South, under U.S. Southern Command. He's the senior officer down there. I have a feeling he's going to be down there for a while, too. In fact, selecting him to do that and where he comes from kind of indicates to me that we're going to be there for a while. And I think that's something we have to look at. And this is interesting. I used to belong to that same command when it was the component command for Northern Command here in the U.S. I've been part of Southcom, but when it was in Panama way back when, but I've been part of that command, so I'm pretty familiar with certainly the headquarters, how they operate. And they switched over to taking over the Southcom mission some years back, and this is in Southcom, which is things south. And they're down there doing that. He's certainly got enough rank to make things happen, and I think he's going to probably morph into being a joint task force commander and potentially a combined joint task force, which is another way of saying multinational joint task force commander, working with a number of different forces from around the world. Now, the Marines normally are oriented toward expeditionary operations, and this is a very expeditionary operation. Marines are oriented towards doing these sorts of unusual, non-traditional civil military or, disaster relief operations, humanitarian assistance. That's something that's definitely in the Marine Corps playbook with our Marine Air Ground Task Force setup. And so this is something that kind of makes sense. And I was really glad to see they did that, because there's just a certain mindset, a certain approach, particularly to planning, that I think that will be very appropriate in what we're seeing here. One of the challenges is that this area is devastated. So when forces are coming in or unit or whatever's coming in, whether it's military or civilian, non-governmental organizations, whatever, when they come into this area, they've got to look at a lot of things. Part of it that is building that, and I say this as a former J2 for a combined joint task force overseas, who looked at similar types of things, these unusual missions, that you're doing a lot of things. You're looking at, can we sustain what's coming in? And they've got to be in there to not just render aid, but they have to sustain themselves. I mean, shelter, food, water, medical care, all the stuff that they need just to operate, and then to go forth and render aid to the Venezuelan civilian population. That's a lot of stuff that has to happen. That's a lot of tasks that have to be performed. And that's something where the military, this task force under Southcom, will really be a kind of what we call a force multiplier, and just providing the information and being able to help everyone get what's coming in, get set up, get operational, and get out there and provide that assistance quicker. So that's going to be a very powerful thing. Again, I should mention, the government doesn't seem to be able to do this for themselves. And so you're going to see a situation where perhaps the international aid is going to far surpass whatever the government's able to do. And inevitably, it's going to kind of overshadow what the government's doing, which is something that has to be managed very carefully. But it's also an opportunity to open up the eyes to a lot of Venezuelans that the U.S. is actually not the big threat that Chavez and Maduro made it out to be, but we're there providing something absolutely critical, helping to save the lives of their family members, their friends, their neighbors, their fellow Venezuelans. I think that's going to be an absolutely critical thing. Disaster assistance in general can be a very powerful political opportunity for countries, along within the country, for leaders, parties, and interest groups, because it comes with a lot of high visibility. It comes with a tremendous amount of public concern, and certainly being able to point to tangible outcomes, having achieved things, can be used to help shape political narratives and eventually influence voter behavior down the line. So these things are very important. As there's an old adage about disasters in politics, which is never let a good disaster go to waste, which is it's a chance to go out there and prove leadership, prove presence, prove the ability of a administration, a regime. In this case, foreign countries will have a chance to demonstrate what they can do for the Venezuelan people up front and personal. So that's going to be big. Natural disasters and emergencies draw massive media coverage, making them implicitly a platform for political messaging and influence. That's just what it's about. I mean, that's whatever they say, whatever they do, fail to do, how they say it, how they don't say it. All those things are going to be building a perception of how we're doing, what's going on, what's happening. And that's something we're obviously, I'm pretty sure that that's something Southcom is very cognizant of in this regard. The visibility can be basically leveraged to showcase all the aforementioned things I talked about. Now, right now, you have interim President Delcy Rodriguez. This was Maduro's vice president, and she's definitely in front of the cameras a lot, saying things, but it's interesting what she's saying. She is saying things which, frankly, go completely against what Maduro says. For example, El Salvador sending in aid. Well, Maduro hated the El Salvador president. He hates the El Salvador government. Yet here they are welcoming aid. Why? Because they need it. I mean, Maduro hated the United States. Here they are. The U.S. is becoming in the great savior, coming in to help out with all these capabilities. And so this is a very interesting thing, which is she's got a very visible presence, but her presence is basically going to shift a lot of mindsets across the board to the U.S. isn't that bad. And that's pretty important because the U.S. is doing a lot of other things in Venezuela. And she went to great lengths to praise President Trump and thanking him for all the U.S. assistance and everything that's coming into the country. So I just found that to be a rather interesting dynamic that has come out of this. It's a strategic opportunity. Obviously, it can provide visible, meaningful support to Venezuelan people in time of great need, and in doing so, it will show how we could be a pathway to helping this government and all the components of this government become more functional and more responsive to what the Venezuelan people need. It's an opportunity at, all the way up to the presidency, but certainly all the way down to what's happening on the street, neighborhood by neighborhood, of making a meaningful working relationship with all elements of Venezuelan society. You're going to have U.S. officials and forces working side by side with their Venezuelan counterparts to include military to military engagement. And you're going to see them saving lives, reducing suffering, doing a lot of things to help the Venezuelan people. This is going to be something that is rather unique that we have not seen so far. Eventually, Delcy Rodriguez, whatever political dynamic comes out of this, at some point, they're more than likely going to have an election. This may accelerate that. If the perception throughout Venezuelan society is that Delcy Rodriguez and the regime she represented is the problem, not the solution, to get them out of the way faster rather than later is the right move, I think this could accelerate when an election is potentially held down there. Won't be held right away. They got to fix a lot of stuff first, but I think you may see that. And I think the U.S. mission down there, because of the scope going from rescue to recovery and all that entails with building up the country, getting the country back on its feet, it could be a more protracted mission. It won't always be done by folks in uniform. I can see it shifting over to some other things, but it kind of works with what the U.S. is trying to do with developing their mineral capabilities like gold mining and stuff, but also trying to get more U.S. involvement, attracting the oil companies back and making sure they think it's safe to invest in the Venezuelan oil industry, which we were heavily invested before. And then basically big oil companies lost their shirts under Chavez and Maduro when they kept nationalizing it over and over again. So that is going to be something I think that may come out of this, which may have real value added. And I think it's going to be critical when elections are very held, that are eventually held, that the current regime is seen in light of what they did or failed to do in this crisis. And obviously, I think that would help move beyond. Certainly, Delcy Rodriguez would probably definitely force her government out of power. So while we're down there for disaster relief, we're going to be building up goodwill. We'll be doing a lot of other things, but I wouldn't be surprised once we start establishing some of this base infrastructure down there, some of the operational base infrastructure, not permanent bases, but, we're going to have something set up at the airport. We're going to have a command structure. I wouldn't be surprised as the disaster rescue moves into long-term recovery that you may see some moves to work with the Venezuelan government on more assertive counter-cartel operations, dealing with the cartels, not from offshore, but actually doing stuff more from within the country. So I do see that. That brings a lot of force protection issues with it that they're going to have to take into account. But I would not be surprised to see that kind of mission creep with the counter-cartel, with the Southern Spear mission, eventually trying to, sort of in many ways, ride on the coattails of what's happening with the disaster relief operation. In short, this earthquake and what we're doing may present a strategic opportunity for the U.S. to reaffirm its influence, its presence, its commitment to Venezuela, and perhaps build the pathway, if you will, for future cooperation on a much more meaningful and much more extensive level. Hey, thanks for listening to STRAT. Please visit STRAT. You can also go to my YouTube channel for Hal Kempfer TV, or you can go to my website at www.gripsa.com. And if you're interested in some longer term type stuff, you can go to Los Angeles InfraGard website at www.infragardlosangeles.org. And I have a dark skies webinar. It's going to talk about things like coronal mass ejections, which is solar weather, talk about electromagnetic pulses, talk about other threats to our, not just our grid system, but things that really have some macro impact. And we've seen a lot of serious weather. I'm going to talk about a near miss that we had not that long ago, relatively speaking, that could have been as big as the famous Carrington event of 1859, which, if that happened today, would have massive repercussions across society, frying everything electronic that you could possibly think of. So talk about that. That's coming up on July 15th. And then, of course, the Gray Zone Threats webinar is still available in encore presentation. So please take advantage of that. And again, thanks for listening to STRAT, and hope you tune in next time.